So I've got a list of questions that people have submitted. So maybe quite a good way of starting is just to go through those. Vida said that it might be nice to talk about some recommendations for people doing guitar exams. Just out of interest, it might be quite interesting to know how many people have done an exam or are going to do an exam, or would like, you know, advice on that aspect if you feel that's useful. I tell you what, why don't we put in, have you seen that thing where you know the reaction button in the bottom right hand corner? If you click on that, you will see a little thumbs up like this. So if you're doing, or you want some help on, or maybe some questions on things like exams, maybe do the thumbs up box, and I can see roughly how many people are doing that. So that's for, okay, 5, fine. Okay, great. So my first question here I've got is from Anish Darnell. Are you there? Maybe if Anish is there, you can make himself known. Maybe he's not appeared yet.
Anish is here. He's putting a thumbs up. You can say something.
He's putting
Anish.
a thumbs up.
Yes.
Where is he? Now let me just see if I can get rid of this.
I'm here. I'm here.
So how can I see Anish, Vida? Why can't I see him?
He's a bearded young man in a blue t-shirt, if that helps.
Oh my.
Yes. He's in the gallery view wearing a blue t-shirt and a bearded young man, as Ajay described him.
Anish, where are you?
And you can also look at the participant list. He's
oh yes, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I'll do that.
Hang on, I'll do something. I'll just change a setting, and then Anish, when you say something, you'll be highlighted.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes the speaker defaults to the screen.
So Anish, you can, if you say hello again, then we can all see
Yes.
you.
Hello. Hello.
Oh yes, there you are with the blue shirt on.
Yes.
Yeah, I can see. Great. So you wrote down here about trying to find your own sound and your own interpretation of a piece.
Yes.
And how you can sort of practice to bring that out, and not copy someone else's interpretation. Yeah, that's an interesting point actually, because whenever you learn a piece, unless it's a completely new piece, we have a perception of other people having performed it before. So it might be that, you know, you've heard John Williams or Julian Bream play something, and then when you start learning, you immediately carry your perception of that piece through their performance. So one of the things you can do, I mean, there are different ways of thinking of it. When you learn a new piece, one can be to sort of go into, possibly not the best word, but isolation, musically speaking. So in other words, don't listen to other recordings for a while. So don't listen to anybody else play it. And try and work your way through the piece just on your own, trying to work out the fingerings and just the ideas and the sounds, how it stimulates you as an individual, and try and learn the piece maybe for a short period of time like that. And then when you've spent some time doing that and you can play the piece to a reasonably good level, then sometimes what I will do is then I will start to listen to some other recordings and get some fresh ideas to pollinate, if you like, or to hybridize with my own way of thinking. So I'll give you an example. I've just recently been doing transcription of the Bach cello suite, you know, the in C major, so I was doing it in a different key. And obviously that's a very, very well-known piece, and it's something that, you know, a lot of guitarists have played, but obviously it comes from the cello, so there are lots and lots of cellists who perform this piece. But I thought, I'm not going to listen to any of the cellists at the beginning. I'm just going to work out my own thoughts and my own way of playing it, and did a transcription. And then just recently, having spent about 6 weeks on and off doing it, then I started to listen to various people performing, you know, people like Casals, and just listening to their tempos and their way of playing it. And then sometimes you think, oh yeah, that's a really interesting idea, I hadn't thought of it like that. Or you think, oh, maybe that tempo is a bit fast, I don't feel it that fast, I definitely feel it a bit slower. Or actually I'm playing it a bit too slow, maybe I need to move it on. So I think sometimes you can find a way of trying to develop because your own imagination is a technique, and it needs developing, like physical technique. So coming up with ideas and creating ways of playing and ways of interpreting music is a skill, and sometimes we have to nurture that. We have to give ourselves the chance. When I teach, sometimes, you know, not every idea a student will come up with is going to be necessarily a good one, but sometimes the trick is to try and encourage that process of coming up with ideas, and then to talk to somebody about which of their ideas maybe are more successful than other ideas. But if you try and impose your way of playing on somebody else, as you say, you end up just copying, imitating, and in a way there's not much point in doing that because somebody's already done that. So as a musician, hopefully the idea should be that you bring something new and you bring your own way of thinking of a piece, but you have to be informed by, I don't know, a heritage or a history of the way something's played in order to do that in a good way. So having said that, sometimes if you're really, really confused by a piece, sometimes I learn a modern piece or something that I don't really feel I quite understand, I will listen to something earlier in the process to try and get my head around how it should sound or might sound. But I quite like that idea of, say you're learning a new piece of Bach, that, you know, it could be that you don't listen to anyone else play it for a little while and work on it yourself, and then go and listen to some versions of it by other players. And of course, if it's guitar music and it's a transcription, violin or cello, make sure you listen to violin and the cello versions as well, because, you know, you learn a huge amount by you know, if it's a piano piece, a lot of guitar pieces are transcriptions, like Asturias and Mallorca by Albanese. They're piano pieces, so I go and listen to some pianists play those pieces, and then sometimes you get different and interesting ways of thinking on the piano that are very different to how we think on the guitar. So that would be sort of how I would encourage you to try and, you know, develop your own way of playing and your own imagination. So I hope that helps a bit. Did you have anything you wanted to ask sort of just before we move on about that?
I also wanted to ask you about, I could not type the thing, but I wanted to ask you how to, like, I think every one of us can get a melody, a short melody that we can compose, but then how to extend that melody into a full-fledged piece, that if you could just give us a brief idea of that thing, it would be very nice. I think every one of us can make a melody, but to extend that melody to a full-fledged piece, it's not a cup of tea for everyone. So if you could...
Yeah, I mean, it's students often ask, I've often heard people who compose say that to me. I come up with quite a good idea, but then I don't know how to carry on. It's a bit like you can come up with a good 8 bars or 16 bars and then struggle to make the piece any longer. I mean, sometimes it might just be that the material is enough for a short piece. If it's a student piece, that's fine. I mean, Birds Flew Over the Spire is only a page long. I didn't try and develop it or do anything else with it. It's a miniature.
That's a lovely piece.
Exactly, and it's intended to be a short, small piece, a bit like a Japanese haiku or something short. It says a lot, hopefully, in a short space of time. I've always quite liked that idea in composing. That I quite like shorter forms. But yeah, essentially, when you're, I mean, if you think of a composer like Bach, the trick with developing an idea, of course, is to move away from the original keys, to develop an idea through different keys and through modulation would be one example. So sometimes what you have to learn is to rework material in different keys. So Bach will take, say we take, you know, something like the prelude from the Prelude, Fugue and Allegro, and you have this. So here he modulates G sharp, and we end up in A major, all right? And then in A major, all he does is repeat. So can you hear how that's exactly the same as the beginning? But we've just gone to another city, you know, musically speaking. Then he modulates again with a C natural. And then we're in E minor. So we've travelled again, you see. And then what he's doing, he's taking the first little bit of the tune, this, he's going. Now we're in B minor, so now he's in the minor key, then we hear the same tune. See, so in a way what we've done is he's taken that opening theme or tune that he came up with, and we've heard it in that key, we've also heard it in, and we've heard it in B minor, you know, and it carries on, the piece carries on, he goes into G major. So it's almost like what he's doing is he's taking the same musical material and saying to you, listen to it in this key, now listen to it in this key, and you get a slightly different perspective on the same musical material, a bit like you would do if you were sitting in a different seat in a different place in the theatre. You know, sometimes you sit on the balcony, sometimes you sit in the stalls, sometimes you sit at the side, you know, sometimes you sit on the other side or behind the stage and you see the actors or the orchestra. So it's a bit like he's moving the material around and helping you see it in a different way. Does that make sense? So modulation is one of the first things you can do, is to travel to another key. And then, of course, there are other things that you can do in terms of, I mean, if you're doing a theme and variations, for example, that's a very common way of developing material. You take the same theme, say like Saw, so you've got this lovely theme, and then he just does variations, decoration. You know, that's the first one, and the next one, of course, is a slower one. So he's done, you know, he's done one that's a decoration there. You see, and then you get. So he's reworking that theme and sort of changing it by use of different tempos, use of the minor key. He doesn't do this actually, but you could use changes of time signature. You can do changes of texture. You know, theme and variations actually is a very good way of practicing some of the techniques to try and think of interesting ways of developing an idea. And then, of course, you know, there are more traditional things like sonata form, which is reliant on, you know, an opening exposition where you know, it's almost like you lay your cards out on the table and your themes and your ideas, and then you develop them in a development section, moving through lots and lots of different keys, and then you come back at the end in a recapitulation to sort of sum up the same material. So it's very much like a story. You know, a great story has a sort of beginning, middle, and an end in a very simple way. So you sometimes have to almost plan it a little bit. Say, right, you know, sometimes with a piece I'll think, well, it's going to be this fast bit at the beginning, then I'm going to sort of slow the tempo down, then I'm going to use this material here, and you almost start laying the bricks out a bit like the foundations of a building. It's a bit rough and ready, but you have a rough plan for the piece. It might be that it's tempos or keys, or, you know, or extended techniques or textures or things. So like with Benga Beat, I knew that the percussion section was going to go in the middle. So I thought, well, I'm going to have that opening bit's going to be in the minor, the middle section is going to be the percussion bit, and then I'm going to modulate to the major for the last section. So I had a kind of 3 chunks idea of what I was going to do, and I sort of put that in position, and then I started to work in detail at those individual things. But, you know, you can learn a huge amount by obviously listening to music, looking at scores. Particularly Bach is great, because if you analyse the modulations, you understand exactly how he's working through all of these different keys. The extraordinary thing about Bach, if you take that prelude, is just how repetitive it is. So if I take this tune, if I clapped the rhythm for that piece, it's this. Not very interesting, is it? So it just quavers the whole time. But what he's doing is the harmony changes in a different rhythm. So you have a harmonic rhythm underneath. Can you see there's a chord sequence underneath, and that's the harmonic rhythm, but the surface rhythm, the river sort of flowing on the top, is very, very regular, but there are other undercurrents or other rhythms that are happening underneath. So, you know, that's a good place to start. Bach, the master. Everything comes from Bach. It's almost like you know, they say that we go back to about 7 matriarchs or something, somewhere back in the dim and distant past. We're all descended from about 7, I think it was 7 female, you know, primates of some kind. It's a bit like you kind of go back to Bach, and everything kind of descends and grows from there, because it's almost like a directory of Western music where everything that people say, oh, I've come up with this great chord, you know, in my new song or my new piece, and you say, I've got some really bad news. Bach came up with that about, you know, 300 years ago. So Bach's basically thought of everything before we have, really. I mean, even things like, you know, this. It's Bach, really. It's sort of it's a sort of neo-Renaissance stroke Baroque piece. Maybe that's why people like it. I'm not sure. It's almost like it's a sort of slightly odd, slightly Baroque, slightly modern kind of feel, which I wasn't deliberately thinking of at all. But maybe that's what it has a tiny bit of.
But
anyway, so I hope that helps. You're going to say something?
Oh, yeah.
Great. Do we have Ahana? She says, I asked Mr. Gary Ryan to discuss his own compositions. I'll kind of talk about that, I think, as I go through. Tanu Priya Sharma. Where's Tanu? Don't be shy. Make yourself known. I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll talk about this. They said to me, for those who want to start composing, do you have any suggestions on how and where to start? That's a tricky one. It depends. I mean, obviously, you have to know. Music theory is very, very important. It's not always what people view as the most exciting element of studying music, but music is a language. And so what do you need to master a language? You need to be able to speak, you need to be able to listen, you need to be able to write it down, and you need to be able to understand and comprehend maybe what's written down in a text. I'm just thinking out loud. So music is the same. We need to be able to play by ear, we need to be able to read, and we need to understand grammar. We need to understand how music is put together and the structures that make something sound like a good piece of music and not such a great piece of music. So, you know, why is Bach considered great and other music's not considered great? You know, there are reasons behind that. So learning music theory is really, really important. You know, if you understand just the basics of things like keys and scales and time signatures and things like notation, things to do with articulation, whether things are staccato or legato, and how to notate dynamics. So being able to express yourself, it's a bit like if you want to write a book or if you want to become a famous author, you have to have mastered your language to a very good level, and you've probably read lots of literature by other great writers before you start writing your own book. So the same thing applies with music. The more you can listen to things, obviously when you're younger you haven't had as much time to listen, but sometimes actually the reason sometimes younger composers can be more interesting or you can be more original when you're younger, ironically, is because you know less. So sometimes when you know more music, it becomes harder to write, or can be harder to write something original that doesn't sound like somebody else. You're not as self-conscious of that when you're younger. You just write. And my advice would be just to have a go. Start with something short, start with something simple, and maybe look for inspiration in certain things. I mean, I'll give you an example that I was talking to Vida about. I will share my screen and I'll show you some pictures that at the time I remember. I've always liked these pictures, and actually one of them's on my wall in my office here. So for Birds Flew Over the Spire, I was influenced by some pictures by an English artist from Cornwall, funnily enough. Vida's down in Cornwall, from St Ives, called John Wells, and I've got them hopefully on my screen. Let me just check where they are first of all, where I've got them. Right, let's put this up on the top. I understand. Just bear with me, I'm looking on the... This is always quite weird when I know you can see me and I can't see you and I'm just fiddling around on my computer. Right. I'm going to flip over my screen and show you a couple of pictures. So for Birds Flew Over the Spire, I was influenced by this picture. Can everyone see that okay? It's a picture by John Wells, and what it is, I don't know what you make of it. I mean, I've always really liked this picture, but you can probably see that there are sort of lines and circles, and these lines are drawings he took of bird flights. So when you go to the sea, particularly in somewhere like Cornwall where you see lots of seagulls flying, what he did was he watched the way they flew and drew the lines of the flight paths. So you can sort of see these sort of spinning vortices and these arcs of flight. And the idea was that it also ends up looking a bit like a ship. So you can see, if you look at the bottom, this is a bit like the hull of the ship, and you have the sails coming up. And so the sails are sort of made out of images of the bird flights. And another time I remember seeing the birds in a place in Wales floating up on thermals. You know, when a bird will just ride a current of hot air and float up, and it just glides, just using its wings, doesn't really fly, it just floats. And there was another picture by him. This is the one I've got on my wall. So it's a picture of a bird, or an imaginary bird. It looks a bit like a sort of pterodactyl or something. And the bird picture is made up of lines of birds flying. So all of the lines are bird flights and bird shapes. So I was sort of thinking, I quite liked this idea and thought that I was trying to translate it into the way that your left hand moves around the fingerboard. So when you play a shape like this, it's almost like a bird flight. So if I'm going 7th position, 4th, 1st. So the way your left hand was moving around the fingerboard was sort of reflective of some of these shapes. So that's just to give you one small example, because I'm not sure I ever wrote in a program note anywhere about this particular piece, and I wouldn't say I wasn't really trying to write the piece to make it sound exactly like the image, but I just got some ideas from that picture. So it might be that, you get your ideas for a piece from a concept or a word or a picture, or you might be inspired by a folk tune or something you already know. You might try and write a variation on, or it might be a word. Sometimes composers will do short sketches based on certain moods or feelings. So it might be that you write a piece that expresses melancholy or anger or joy, or you can try these as little exercises, write some little sketches perhaps that explore trying to express musically a certain emotion. So sometimes you find you can learn quite a lot by narrowing yourself down to a small task. So sometimes a short piece where you're not allowed to do very much. So that's one of the things I quite enjoy about writing early grade pieces, is it might be that I can only use very limited musical tools. I maybe can only write it in certain time signatures, certain keys. I can only use a limited range of notes, maybe simple rhythms like crotchets, quavers and minims, or eighth notes, quarter notes, half notes, and then sometimes with less tools at my disposal, you sometimes then have to be more imaginative with what you do. So that would be my advice if you're wanting to start. People often say to me, "Oh, I'd like to write something, but it won't be very good." But that's the same with anything that you start trying to do for the first time. When I started to play the guitar, I wasn't very good at the beginning. So if you want to become good at something, you have to start somewhere. So you have to start, with simple things. And the same applies with composition. Sometimes you start with a simple idea, maybe some, if you're a teacher, you might enjoy writing some simple pieces for your students. If you're a young guitar student, just write something that's very, very straightforward. Maybe would have been an early grade piece or an initial piece, grade 1 piece, and try and think about, what you do to make it very, very straightforward and easy. Think quite a lot about form and structure. Phrase length is important. Which keys you're going to write in, which time signature you're going to use, because every one of those things imposes a different creative structure. So if I write something in C major in 2/4, that's going to be very different to something in D major in 3/4, or something in A major in 6/8. So it could be that you give yourself little tasks and you think, right, I'm going to write a piece in 2/4, then I'm going to write another piece in G major in 3/4, then I'll do another piece in A major using a compound time, 6/8. Maybe I'll write one in irregular time. When you get more advanced, you think I might explore writing 5/8 irregular time. I might try something in a modal scales, Dorian mode, Lydian mode, something like that. So you can give yourself a little brief, a task, and try and stick to that. A bit like artists who do sketches. All of the great painters would do simple drawings before doing a very large canvas. So you can often go back and see the sketches that led to their very, very big paintings. And you often find that's the case with the composers. They'll sometimes sketch things out beforehand before working them into a larger scale thing like an orchestral work. Or something bigger and longer. So I hope that helps. Let me just get rid of my screen reversing. So I'll show you those just once more so you get the idea. So that one's called, you can find these at the Tate Modern down in Cornwall. There were some artists who lived down in a place called St Ives in Cornwall, and they love the light, obviously because it's next to the sea, so there's lots of great light and the air is really clear. So apparently it's very, very good if you're a painter. That's why they all live down there. So you've got the, I think that one's called Aspiring Forms, and this one was called Seabird Forms. So those are the, partly contributed. Had I not seen those paintings at some point, I probably wouldn't have actually ended up writing that piece in that particular way. So it's an interesting idea. A creative process is about all sorts of different things that you do that aren't just to do with music and listening to music. They're about, you know, the films you watch, the people you meet, the places you travel to, the food that you eat. You know, it's about living and about life. And actually, then what you do through your music is hopefully you express something of the things that you like or that you want to communicate, or, you know, maybe the things that you struggle with. And music can become quite a therapeutic, cathartic thing that helps you to explore sometimes things that are quite hard to put into words in a traditional sense. There's an old saying that says that, you know, where words leave off, music begins. In other words, when you can't express yourself any more articulately through words, you start to use music to try and express it. And I think a lot of, you know, throughout history, obviously a lot of composers have channeled their, you know, emotional turbulence, if you like, through their compositions. Anyway, I will unshare my screen. Stop sharing. Put my glasses back on again. Tristy, how will I know whether a piece could be 100 times more interesting than I'm making it? I'm not sure. That's a tricky one to answer. I mean, the most important thing, if you're learning from a score, is just to make sure that at the very beginning you observe all of the detail in the score. Now, if you watch a film and you see, you know, a great landscape that you know that when you see it on the screen, it's only 2 dimensions, but in real life, there's all sorts of things that the screen doesn't convey. It doesn't convey the 3-dimensional element of the landscape. So say you see the Grand Canyon on a film, you're seeing it on a 2-dimensional surface, and if you think of the expanse of the Grand Canyon, the size of it, you know, the temperature when you get there, maybe the smell of the air or the light, you can't really convey that on a screen in quite the same way. And music, in a sense, is the same. You can't quite convey on a piece of paper or a screen and some dots on a page exactly what a piece should sound like, but you can start from there. So you start by observing everything that's on the score to start with. So, you know, obviously things like dynamics, tempo markings, making sure we're playing all the correct notes, the correct rhythms, and detail is an amazingly important element of learning. Now, of course, that's not enough just to read from the score. You then sometimes have to listen to people performing the piece, or you have to get used to playing it in front of people a lot before you start to feel more confident about how to play it when you're nervous. For example, that's going on to the exams thing. One of the things I would say, this is related to the exams, make sure that you've played your pieces a lot in front of people before you do the exam. So don't make the exam the very first time that you go in and play your pieces. You know, play it to some people at school, play it to your friends, play it to your family, maybe record yourself a few times so you put yourself under a bit of pressure. Then when you go and do the exam, hopefully it's a continuation of that process whereby you are just doing another performance in front of somebody. Performance often becomes difficult when you've never played pieces before and then you have to try them for the first time, and exams are often a good example of that. So to make your piece more interesting, for example, sometimes people don't always observe all the dynamics, or they don't always observe all the marks of articulation, things to do with legato and staccato and phrasing and shaping, or maybe they don't quite get the tempo right, or there's not enough in the way of colour changes in the right hand where you move from maybe the bridge to the fingerboard. So it's a bit like the difference between black and white and colour. Sometimes you can hear people play pieces and they sound a bit black and white, so they've got the notes, they've got the correct tempo, but it needs a bit of colouring in. And that's where the dynamics and the articulations and the detail that the composer puts down on the score give you extra information to hopefully make the piece more colourful and interesting. The tricky thing is that all music is printed in black and white. I always think that it should be a colour element to it. But so sometimes it looks very black and white on the page, but we're talking about colours all the time. So try and remember that there are things sometimes that aren't printed in the score that we might add. We might add a creative touch. We might add some colour. We might try some different ideas to make it sound slightly different, a different twist on what we've heard before. But you can learn a lot, you know, from having, you know, talked with Anish earlier on. You can learn a lot by imitation, sometimes by trying to copy someone and trying to impersonate the way they play. You can learn a huge amount, but then that sometimes then gives you the tools and the control to be able to start developing your own ideas in a more distinct and interesting way. You know, when we go and see a guitarist play in a concert, say in somewhere like Calcutta, we don't want each artist who walks onto the stage to be the same. We don't want them to sound the same. We don't want them to be playing the same material. What we're interested in is the differences between them. We're interested in the different music they play, the different guitars they have, the different ways they interpret Bach. Sometimes people play their own compositions. We're interested in the new compositions of one person. Maybe we want to hear somebody else play Bach. Perhaps we want to hear Pavel Steidl playing Paganini. You know, perhaps we want to hear John Williams playing Spanish stuff, which he was also fantastic at. So that's the really interesting thing, is to find your niche and the music that you feel you really connect with and you enjoy, and then you make it interesting, hopefully, through what you express in terms of having observed all the detail on the score. So that would be my advice about trying to make it, you know, more interesting. Okay, how are we doing? 11:08. We're fine. Adash, are you there? Adash has asked me to say how to focus while practicing. I know exactly what you mean. I'm always going off and having tea and biscuits when I'm practicing. So I start off practicing for about... Who likes practicing in the morning? Are you a morning or an evening practicer? It's an interesting idea. You know, I'm a bit of a night owl. I'd rather practice late. Sometimes I quite like practicing later in the day. But focusing while practicing, do shorter amounts of practice is a good thing. There's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that we learn better if we do about 40 minutes to start with. You know, so the first 20 minutes generally is quite good, and the last 20 minutes is quite good. So 40 minutes idea is quite a good period of time. If, for example, you're getting physically tired, or you're straining your hands, or you're finding it hard to concentrate, then 40 minutes is actually quite a good time frame. You can go away, you know, you could go for a walk, you could do something else, watch TV, have a cup of tea, have lunch, 40 minutes before lunch, 40 minutes after lunch. Or it might be that you can achieve something useful in 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes after lunch, and 20 minutes in the evening. I think there's a certain benefit in practicing for a slightly longer period of time, because by the time you've warmed up, you don't want to warm up for 20 minutes and then stop. So if you warm up for 20 minutes and then you do 20 minutes really, really good practice, then maybe have a break, then come back and do another bit of practice. That sometimes helps keep the practice feeling fresh, so that you're not getting too tired or too bored of something, perhaps. Sometimes having a structure, you can decide, you know, I don't always work like that, but some people like to have, you know, warm-up routine, maybe play some scales. Then you might have 3 pieces and you spend an equal amount of time perhaps exploring each one, so that you've divided your time equally amongst them. Have variety in your practice, you know, lots of different things that you can do, so that when you practice each day, it's not always exactly the same. Sometimes repetition of the same process can become boring. But it might be that, you know, you spend a long period of time practicing on one day on one piece. The next day you do a different piece. The next day maybe you start looking at a new piece. The day after that maybe you practice some scales. Perhaps the one after that you do a bit of sight reading. So you can mix it up a little bit. Just think about why we get bored in everyday life. You know, it's normally kind of repetition, isn't it? Repetition of stuff. Sometimes that's comforting and it's good to have a routine and to do the same thing. But we like change, we like a bit of variety, and we like to do new things. And I think sometimes if you translate that idea into your practice, you know, how you balance what you've got to learn. Obviously a deadline's important. If you need to get something ready, say by December, you can draw out a plan and sort of think, well, this is what I need to do between now and then. I find sometimes a diary can be quite useful if I've got a, you know, performance, or let's say somebody had an exam. Sometimes I like to know the number of weeks I've got coming up to a specific event so that I can pace my playing a little bit more. So that would be my advice on the practice. Originality and maturity in playing. Well, we talked a little bit about the original side of things. Maturity, I think, comes just from the word itself. It's obviously just from getting older, having more experience. You can develop greater confidence playing in front of people, definitely. I mean, there's an expression that says first of all, you learn how to play a piece, and then you learn how to play it in public. And the two things are quite different in a way. So sometimes everyone's probably said that. I played this piece perfectly okay when I was at home yesterday afternoon. Then they go and do a concert or an exam and they say, oh, it was rubbish today. It was so much better yesterday when I was at home. And that's because playing in front of people is a different challenge to playing on your own. And it requires experience, and it requires perseverance, and you have to deal with frustration and disappointment. But eventually, if you keep getting back on the horse, as it were, you keep doing it, you keep trying to play the same piece, and you get more confident, that's where your maturity comes from. It's from the knowledge that you've done it lots and lots of time. So think of anybody who's good at something, great tennis player like Roger Federer, he doesn't win every single match, but he wins most of the matches. So, if you're a musician, you don't always play brilliantly, but, some days hopefully you play really well, and other days it's not so good. And that's just a natural part of studying an instrument. It's like sport. You wouldn't expect a team to win all the time. They have off days, they don't play so well. So maturity really just comes from sometimes being experienced at performing, just having greater awareness and knowledge of the natural variation in the quality of what you can produce when you perform. Some days we feel, very inspired. Sometimes I walk on a concert platform, I feel very relaxed, very, very inspired and loose, and find it easy to play. And other days I find it harder. I'm more nervous, or I'm a bit more tight, perhaps not quite so physically relaxed, or perhaps I'm tired, or maybe I've not been well, a couple of days beforehand. So all sorts of things feed into whether we play well or not. But I think that's where maturity comes from. What will be the key skills or exercises to develop playing? Well, that's a very broad question. There's probably not quite enough time to go into it, but obviously, guitar is a two-handed creature. You've got your left hand and your right hand, and however good you are, I always think one of those hands is a bit weaker than the other. Not just because whether you're left-handed or right-handed, but just when you play. For me, I always find my right hand is a fraction less secure than my left. For some people, it's the other way around. So obviously, you've got to work at developing the technique of both hands to a good level. So it's no good having a really good left hand and a very weak right hand, and vice versa. So you need to develop a good sound. That's a really, really important part of playing. And you need to be able to develop variety of colour. So, for example, if you're playing... I don't know how well this will come over the internet, but, if I'm playing an E major chord, let's say I just play this chord, I can create a variety of different colours in the right hand. I'll just move the screen down a bit. By moving. So that's just from changing the angle of the nail. And then of course I can couple that with fingering. So let's say we took an open E, very common note, I can play that in a variety of different ways, but then I can also play it in different locations with different colours. This is a very different sound to this one. So it's an instrument of colour. It's almost like a little, people often talk about it, it's like a mini orchestra where you're creating different colours and different sonorities. So you need to be able to develop a range of sound. You need to be able to project to a reasonable level. The guitar is a gentle instrument, but you can play fairly strongly when you develop a good sound. Obviously, it's important to have a good posture, just to feel comfortable and relaxed when you play, so that you've got good control of the instrument. What else is another key skill? I always remember Charles Ramirez, one of my colleagues at the Royal College, sort of saying that I can't remember his exact way of describing this, but he said that I think it was something like, to play the guitar you needed to do 8 things. Just 8. So it was something like that. So for example, you need to be able to pluck a string. That's one thing you've got to be able to do. You've got to be able to press a note in the left hand. You've got to be able to shift, for example. You've got to be able to strum. You've got to be able to do things like a tremolo. So, I mean, you'd need Charles to explain it, but the idea was that at the root of it, there are some quite simple things. We need to be able to press the notes in the left hand. We need to be able to produce a good sound in the right. We need to be able to play with variety of colour, and we need to be able to project. We need a good posture. So there's sort of key skills that I'm sure most teachers would sort of explain to you from the beginning. But I think for me, in some ways, one of the most important things is the sound you make, because there's a great old Duke Ellington quote where he says, the great jazzer, and he says, "If it sounds good, it is good." And I've always liked that idea that when you listen to something that's good, you don't question it. You don't listen to someone play. Let's say you hear some great guitar playing. You don't think, "Oh, I really like that guitar playing, but I'm not sure about his posture or his left hand position or which strings he's using or which guitar he's playing." Well, you might think that, but you just think, "That's great playing. That's really great music," or "Where can I buy that music?" or "Where can I buy that recording?" or "Where can I download the CD?" Or the MP3 or whatever. I'm still catching up with the 20th century. So great music transcends all of these things, and a lot of great musicians. Look at Django Reinhardt. He only had 2 fingers in the left hand. If you watch what he could do on the guitar, it was absolutely incredible. 2 fingers, just zips around with those 2, and that's it. Some people don't always realise that, so you have to go and watch Django Reinhardt now and see that what he achieved really from just that basic limitation was quite extraordinary. So nothing. If most guitarists, if you imposed the technique of another player onto another guitarist, they wouldn't be able to play. So if you took, I don't know, Manuel Baraweko's technique would not fit David Russell. David Russell's technique would not fit John Williams. John Williams' technique would not fit Julian Bream's. Julian Bream's technique was not going to fit anybody's, I don't think. He was a one-off in a sense. But you can see that everybody develops their own way of playing, but there are a core set of skills you need in order to sort of reach a basic level of proficiency, from which then you become hopefully a bit more individual. Okay. Deepak, about composition, do you fix a melody and build the harmony, or the other way? Positives and negatives of composing for guitar. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I always think writing for the guitar is an obstacle course. So if I go to the piano, I can do most things that I want to do. If I come up with an idea or a chord or a harmony, I can normally play it almost immediately on the piano. But I can't always do that on the guitar. So there are some keys that are extremely difficult to play in. So it's almost like there are kind of no-go areas that you can't always quite make things work musically. So you have to learn how to adapt and to steer around things. And that's why, some transcriptions will work very well on the guitar, and other pieces you just think, I could never make that work on one guitar. It might be that you could make it work on 2, but as a solo guitar. So yeah, there are lots of obstacles to get round. There was an old joke that used to say that all guitar music's in the key of E minor, which I think is a bit unfair, but the reason being that, when you play the open strings, you're already in E minor. So obviously E minor is an easier key than F minor. Now why is that? Of course, because F minor you need the bar chord for the root. So, you probably won't find many guitarists who've learnt a piece of music in F minor. We don't really do flat keys very well on the guitar, and if you want to play in F minor, you're better off writing your piece in E minor and putting the capo on at the first fret to transpose it into F minor. So it will sound in F minor but be played in E minor. So there are things to do with the nature of the open strings and the fingerboard that make certain keys more conducive to easy idiomatic writing. I mean, I'll give you an example of that. I did a book of Piazzolla arrangements quite a long time ago, and Piazzolla often modulates up a semitone in his pieces. But the problem with that on the guitar is that as soon as if you're trying to write a book of guitar arrangements that's easy or intermediate, and something modulates up a semitone, it becomes very, very difficult straight away. So I was playing in A minor. Most guitarists are comfortable with A minor. It's a key we're very, very familiar with, and it has other related keys which are comfortable and easy to play, things like C major, E minor, you know, all sorts of keys that relate to the tonic dominant. So if you're an A minor, you know, it's a nice comfortable key. We've all played lots of music, you know, Saw, Giuliani, Carcassi, all the traditional guitar composers have explored that key. Now if you're Piazzolla and then you suddenly go up a semitone to B flat minor, that's a very, very difficult key. So I couldn't suddenly modulate up like Piazzolla does into B flat minor and then have a book that was easy guitar pieces. It's just not possible. So you have to pick certain keys and ways of arranging. If I go into B flat minor, the subdominant is E flat minor, the dominant's F, and then the tonic's B flat minor. Those are hard keys, you know, so that's a bit like grade 8 knowledge, and A minor can be played much more with sort of say grade 4 or 5 knowledge. So often the keys that you set things in, or you arrange things in, or you compose in, affect the level of complexity or difficulty that you can introduce into a piece. So it depends what you're trying to write. If you're just writing freely as a concert piece for a very high level player, you can obviously do a lot. If you're trying to write a piece that's for grade 2 or grade 3 or grade 4, what I find interesting is to trying to keep it simple, but also to try and find richness harmonically within a simple world, to try and make things, if you like, sound harder and more complex than they actually are physically to play. Actually, a good example of that is the key of B minor. We tend to think of B minor as being quite hard, but you've got an open B, and then if you play the bass line, that's just with your second finger. But on the page, on the paper, it looks quite complicated, but physically to play, it's actually quite straightforward. It's quite easy. So there can be a mismatch sometimes between how things appear on notation and how they sound when you actually end up starting to play them. So yeah, it's a weird instrument to write for. My old guitar teacher at the academy used to think the guitar fingerboard was like a chessboard. So I don't know if there are any chess players out there, but you know, it's very chess-like. If you move a piece, as soon as you move a piece into one place, you open up new pathways on the chessboard and you close down other paths. So it's all about opening up and closing down possible futures. So by turning right, you eliminate turning left. And guitar fingerings are very like that. Sometimes the way you design a fingering will enable you to do certain things and to go in certain directions that you can't then go off in other directions. But one of the things I have always found interesting about the guitar is the duplication of notes. So obviously when you take a note like E, open E, E on the second string, E on the third string, E on the fourth string, harmonics, 7th fret, 5th string, 5th fret, 6th string, artificial harmonics. So, you know, you can take a note like E, I can play that in 3 places. So I can either, say I wanted to create a texture with a repeated E, I can either do it on one string, which is all articulated, or I can do it on 2 separate strings. I could detach that, or I could go onto another string and have 3 E's. And then before you even introduce the colour. So there are different ways of creating overtones or over-ringing of notes. So in Birds Flew Over the Spire, the first, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah. First 5 notes all over-ring. So the idea is that they're a bit like harp strings. Now I could have played them down here. Doesn't sound as good, hopefully. Well, I hope you think it doesn't sound as good. Is not the same as. That's a very, very different texture and sound because of sixth position and campanella fingerings to if I play in first position. So sometimes it's the sort of textures that I'm interested in exploring as well, that you can take a very common sound but give it a different flavour or a different twist. So, E major can be played there, but you can also play it here or there. I could even go up here if I really wanted to. Where's G sharp? So there's my... Maybe I'll try this one. Don't do this fingering, by the way. This is just showing you that I could play it in a different place. So I could do it there, or I can do it here, or here. Now, obviously the one I preferred was that one, which is, it feels nice and comfortable and easy to play, and I quite like finding that on the guitar, things that feel, they feel natural and idiomatic and comfortable to play, because then I think sometimes the music sounds free and very fluid and easy. A lot of guitar music can feel like you're slightly battling with, especially if it's music written for piano, it's like it can be really hard to make it fit onto the guitar. It's a bit like trying to fit something into a smaller room. You've got less room to maneuver. But I think in some ways it's sort of frustrating and rewarding at the same time, because it's a bit like a puzzle that you have to solve. I've often thought that guitar fingerings and writing is a bit like Sudoku or something. When you kind of get it right, it all kind of slots into position. So although I find it sometimes slightly infuriating in an affectionate way, that process in some ways is one of the interesting things. It's almost like a combination of music making, creativity and puzzle solving. For me, that's kind of what writing for the guitar is like. But I do, when I go to the piano, I sometimes actually on lockdown I've been playing the piano quite a lot, because I used to play it a lot when I was younger, and that was one of the really nice things. I had some extra time to be able to go to the piano and play. But sometimes I will come up with chords and things on the piano and I'll think, can I make that work on the guitar? And sometimes you have to, change or revoice a chord in order to make it work. Right, now let me have a quick look.
Hi, Sam. Just a follow up on the same thing. I'm Deepak actually. So, like your composition on the Bird Flow, the Spire, like it has the guitar, right? Like you compose it for the guitar. So if you have to do it for the same, like an orchestral version or something, so would it be the same what you wrote for the guitar, or is it going to be expanding more than this?
That's a really interesting question. I've never thought of expanding it or writing it. I mean, I could put it onto the piano very easily, and it would probably be, very similar on the piano. I might, obviously on the piano you can sometimes double things that you can't. It's easier to play octaves on the piano, for example, than it is on the guitar. So it would be broadly very similar. Orchestra, of course, is a different thing because you're opening it out into multi-dimensions. So, I'd have to think about what I would do for that and whether it would work. I mean, I'm sure a harp would feature as part of it because you need that over-ringing. But I would definitely probably gravitate more towards strings and woodwind than it would, for example, to brass or percussion. So, you often start thinking in a particular sound world. So the line is more like violin, viola, and cellos down in the bass with some double bass, maybe some harp, maybe a bit of flute. It's got that sort of purity of sound. So it's a good question, because you can learn a lot sometimes with your own interpretations by imagining the other way round. So you imagine if this was an orchestral piece, which instrument would be playing the theme, how would it sound? And sometimes by thinking outside the guitar, you know, like with the cello, how would the cello bow this? How would a woodwind player articulate it? You know, tonguing or slurred. How would a singer breathe? You know, where's the end of the phrase? Sometimes by thinking in that way, it's almost like translating a word into a different language. You think in a different language and then you bring it back to the guitar, and you often get a good insight into how you should be thinking of the piece and playing. So yeah, I think broadly speaking it would stay the same. Although funny enough, I have just recently written a piece. It wasn't really an extension of Birds Flew Over the Spire, but I did write a longer piece that was quite similar to this, called The Stillness of Summer. Not Memories of Summer, The Stillness of Summer, which actually is slightly longer. So yeah, it might change very slightly and be a little bit longer, but broadly speaking, I think it would. Hopefully, you would recognise it. I think would be my guess. You'd sort of say, "Well, this sounds familiar," you know, if you heard it orchestrated. It's quite a nice idea. Maybe I'll go ahead and do that. I'm not really very expert on orchestration. I've just about mastered the guitar and the piano. That's about it. I've not mastered them, but anyway. Thank you for that question. I'm just having a look along the chat. Let's have a look. A question in case there's time. How to approach free stroke descending slurs or those that let the lower adjacent string ring freely against? Free stroke descending slurs. Yeah, I mean descending slurs, when you're playing downwards, you need to always make sure that you've got the slur that you're descending to in position. So if I was going like that, I've always got my fingers on the string. So don't slur onto a note like that. Have the note down before. And so you're trying to avoid the slurring finger being snapped against it. Yeah, I see what you mean. So yeah, when you're on lower strings, it's a bit trickier. But you basically just have to keep, this is what David Miller, my old teacher, used to call the anchor finger. So, you know, you anchor a slur down. Say you're playing 2 and 1. 1 has to be held very, very firmly. 2 has to be quite light. But they are notoriously difficult. Descending slurs are much harder than ascending ones generally. One danger can be just to sort of be pressing a little bit too hard on the fingerboard when so that you get too much tension in your arm and your wrist. It's interesting you call them free stroke slurs, yeah, because some people think of them like that. You can have a rest stroke slur where you press down onto the fingerboard, or you can pull upwards and away. Sometimes the right hand can help if you've got spare fingers. It can block off potentially dissonant strings that might sound. So say I wanted to avoid open E, like that. If I block the E in the right hand, I'm not going to hit it because it's damped by the right. So that can sometimes give you a little bit of extra security. Let's have a look. Dampening the top side, not palm side of the thumb, without shifting the hand or bending the thumb. I think this is probably to do, so this is Justin's question, how to damp with the top side, not palm side of the thumb. I'm not quite sure exactly what this means, but essentially if you damp, I mean, some people drop the thumb back, some obviously just use the hand, which is obviously what you're referring to in your question. I mean, I use quite a lot of damping in the right hand just by touching the strings with my thumb. So you don't necessarily have to drop back changing your hand position. You can just, so say I've played A in the bass, and then I play E. If I want to go back after playing A, and to damp the bass E, I'll just touch it, like that. I won't drop my hand back, like that. I find it doesn't suit my technique, actually. I find it quite awkward. So if I'm damping bass strings, I don't know if you can see that close up. It's that, really, see. So it's like a preparation. So sometimes, you know, the thumb goes round and tidies up after itself. So that's sort of how the damping can can work. I mean, it's tricky just in a short space of time to explain. There's obviously a lot to these techniques, but other genres such as blues or jazz into classical pieces, yeah, that's an interesting one. Well, I mean, unless they're specifically written into the piece, you probably don't necessarily need to incorporate it. It's quite hard to know. What sort of context did you mean with this one? Do you want to explain a bit more?
As a part of an original composition.
As part of an original composition, yeah. Well, what are the techniques that you like?
Not exactly in jazz, but I mean, it's also used in classical with a lot of tremolo and stuff.
Well, I mean, the trick, sometimes going back to what we were talking about, how you start to compose, is it might be that if that's a sound you say you like tremolo, you might think, right, I'm going to write myself a short tremolo piece and learn how to explore tremolo. And then you understand the tremolo, and then you can incorporate it into your piece. I'll give you one example. I've always quite liked the sound of the nail playing a bit like a plectrum, but without a plectrum. So when I was much younger, I did some examining in Dublin, and there were lots of plectrum guitar players, and they were fantastic. They were really, really good. So quick. So I quite liked the idea of being able to do something that was a bit like a plectrum, but without using a plectrum. So I'm just using the back of the nail. I've always quite liked that sound. I think you get quite a different sound when you play pits, but with the back of a nail. It's obviously very different to a flesh sound. I don't know how well that's coming across the internet, but so that was a sound that I quite liked. And when I originally wrote Rondo Rodeo, you know, my piece from Scenes from the Wild West, there were lots of funny sounds I quite liked. I've always liked this sound up the end, you know. Sometimes it's more about extended techniques for me rather than sounds from other styles of playing. But yeah, I suppose I was thinking a bit like that. I've always liked the sound of just hammering onto the fingerboard. You get some interesting sonorities there. So in what I was trying to do quite often was throw in things like that. I think there's a passage where I kind of go where's it? I can't remember my own piece. Anyway, and I was using the back of the nail. So sometimes the trick is to write, if you like, it's hard to say really, but you have to decide which techniques you want to include. Don't try using too many. Sometimes rationing is good. You know, you can put less in rather than more. And write your piece, sketch it out sort of normally, as it were, and then start to think where might be a good place to include some of the techniques which I really enjoy playing. So, I mean, for example, bent notes are quite interesting. It's a very common sound, you know, in blues and electric guitar playing. So where might that be an interesting thing to explore? It might be that you try a little sketch exploring bent notes. Quite a good sound, you see. Now, I was always interested in this idea of what's a normal sound on the guitar and what's an extended technique, like a weird sound or a different sound, and who decides that? You know, why do we decide that this, you know, is normal, but somehow if we kind of go, I don't know, like this, that's a weird sound, or if we do this, you know, but that's a part, for me, that's a part of the sound the instrument makes. You know, the percussive element is in some ways almost an equal part of the sound world to the normal way of playing. So I was quite interested in thinking along those lines, that any sound could be used and trying to sort of blend them all together. A friend of mine said something really interesting. He said he thought the guitar was a percussion instrument with strings, which is quite an interesting way of thinking. I'll leave that thought planted in the ether. Shamal, how did the composition originate? So this is Sidyarth Sarangi. Yeah, Shamal, first of all, the music will be out very soon. I've nearly finished the score for this. The idea came from a trip to Saudi Arabia where I was playing with an oud player. So the tuning was sort of reflective of the oud. It's not exactly the same, but so I was doing C, G, D, G, C, E, and then I was always been very interested in a scale called the octatonic scale, the diminished scale, which is a scale made up of semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone. So you've got one extra note in the scale from the traditional pattern. So if you play it, it goes. Where am I? That's the scale basically. So I was using a modal pattern with an altered tuning that was reflective of the oud, and it produces some really interesting sonorities, like there's some really interesting sort of sounds. Yeah. And that was, you know, quite an alien sound. I think I started off with a string fold as well. So you fold the bottom string over the top two, so you get like a... And when I did this improvisation, it was in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, actually, at the concert at the British Embassy. They had lots of percussionists as part of it as well. So some of the percussive ideas came from... It was basically from an improvisation I did in Saudi Arabia, which is not something you say every day, but that's kind of where the idea for the piece came from. But yeah, it's quite fun to play, actually. So that's essentially where the inspiration came from. Does that help? Did you have any more questions you wanted to ask about it?
Yes, actually, I had a lot of questions, but since there's not much time, I'll just ask one or two maybe. Yeah, so I would like to know, how can one expand on their repertoire? Like, how can they learn many pieces, like, for example, while doing concerts, and how to keep many programs in the fingers?
How do you... yes, that's right. There's a few here, aren't there? Yes, I can see you've written a few. You mean, how do you keep... Say you learn 3 pieces. How do you keep them going while you learn another new piece?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. It's a bit like juggling. So you've got to... It depends how hard the pieces are that you're trying to keep going. Some pieces you can leave for quite a long time. It's a bit like food. You know, you can reheat them in the oven and they're fine. You know, and other pieces, if you reheat them too long afterwards, you make yourself ill. So just... You need to understand sometimes how pieces fade away from your fingers. So sometimes when I leave a piece for a week, it feels a bit rusty, but okay. And another piece I'll leave for a week and it'll feel like I can't play it anymore. Well, maybe not a week, but, you know, let's say 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and I'll come back to it. Sometimes think, I've forgotten lots of this piece. I can't, you know, I don't feel ready. Other pieces are a bit easier and a bit more natural, or maybe I found them easier to play and I find I can play them very, very quickly, you know, maybe with a couple of days refreshing the practice to get them back up to the standard. So I think each piece has a different level of decay. And you have to sort of start to learn that for yourself, how that pattern works, you know, which pieces of yours go rusty very quickly and which pieces you can leave for quite a long time and they tend to be okay and you remember them quite well. So I think that's the trick. There's nothing to stop you, maybe every, I don't know, 4 or 5 days running just through the pieces. You don't have to practice them in any great depth, but you can just refresh them and keep them in your mind. So sometimes if I'm playing a program and there are some pieces in it that I haven't played for a little while, I will just run through them maybe, you know, a couple of times in the weeks running up to it, just to make sure they're still there in my mind and not too distant and like I've forgotten them. So let's say, for example, you were learning a new piece and you let your program slip. you know, for 4 or 5 days. Maybe at the end of 5 days, the next practice session, you run through your 3 pieces again and make sure they're just still ticking along okay. And then you can go back to your new pieces again. So you don't have to, it's not all or nothing. You don't have to leave them completely, but you can sometimes just put them in the back room for a little bit and then just play them slightly less often. And then hopefully over time, you know, you gradually acquire a wider repertoire. Obviously that takes time. You know, the older you get, the more time you have to learn the pieces and the more experience you have of playing them. So naturally, as you get older, your repertoire will expand. So that would be my advice on that one. Yeah, I mean, you learn pretty quickly which piece. Some pieces are okay, they feel all right to play, but I think I wouldn't be ready to play them in a concert again. I'd have to do a bit more practice before I feel really confident to play them in front of people. But sometimes I can play them quite quickly on my own in the room when I'm relaxed at home. But I'd need to do a bit more work to make them super secure for my live performances. Good guitar. Yeah, good guitar is very important. Obviously, you know, no one wants to play on a bad instrument, but the good thing in some ways with the guitar is that you don't have to spend a fortune on an amazingly good instrument. It's not like cellos and violins, you know, where we have to, a bit like buying a house, you know, buying a decent cello or a violin. But, and also on the guitar, you know, you can spend, I don't know, I'm talking in English money, but £10,000 on a guitar. That's not necessarily any better than one that costs £5,000 or £3,000. It depends on the make of the guitar and the level you're playing at. But yeah, a reasonably good quality guitar, good quality strings is important. As long as the guitar's got a good action and is comfortable physically to play, it will be fine for you to work on as a player. So my advice would be, I definitely, in my experience, don't think you necessarily have to spend astronomical sums of money to find a decent, good quality instrument. And it's quite surprising how good some instruments can be that are cheaper. And actually, you can learn a lot by playing on an instrument that's not quite so good, because you have to find the sounds, you have to search out the colours, and you have to work around some of the difficulties and idiosyncrasies of that guitar. And all guitars are like that. They all have slightly different qualities, just like people, that you have to understand in order to make them sort of respond to what you do. So quite often, to play a very good guitar well, you need to have played other guitars on your journey, you know, up the ladder to that point. Otherwise you can't draw out the best sounds of that particular guitar. It would be quite interesting, I often think, at the Royal College, if all of the students played on the same guitar for 1 year. It would be a bit strange, but it would be interesting, because then they would understand that the reason they sounded different was because of the way they played and not because of the guitar. And I think that's the slight danger, is that sometimes we look for quick fixes in a guitar that are actually things we need to develop in our playing. And one of the lovely things about buying a new guitar is that when you go onto a new guitar, some problems become solved. You think, oh good, it feels much easier. At the same time, some other problems are still there, and you think, that's me, you know, I still need to improve that. But the guitar can help, but you still need to be able to control it and to play it well, to draw out the very, very best. It's a bit like being a chef. You know, you can have the best ingredients for your meal, but, you know, you've got to understand the process of cooking well in order to make that into something that's a really, really tasty dish for people that they want to eat. So I'm sure you get where I'm kind of coming from. Good. Now, how are we doing? Let's have a look. Keep the hands relaxed while playing. Yeah, hands relaxed. Breathing is important. Always breathe. Make sure you're breathing when you're playing the guitar. Guitarists do what I sometimes call playing underwater, where they don't breathe for a bit, or they shallow breathe. Because the guitar's quite quiet, we don't always allow ourselves. We're sort of like, it's a bit like being trying to walk around quietly at night. We're sort of not breathing properly. We're kind of tiptoeing around, so we don't always breathe well. Keeping the hand relaxed while playing, yeah. Warming up is very, very important. Obviously, just make sure your hands are nicely warm. Sometimes one thing that I found helps when I'm playing very difficult passages in either hand, don't look at them. Sometimes when you look at your hand doing difficult stuff, it can be quite intimidating, and you get a feedback loop of lots of visual information coming back at you, which sometimes makes you question what you would do naturally and subconsciously without thinking. So sometimes when you've practiced something, you don't actually need to look at it directly in order to be able to execute it. And I find sometimes when I'm playing a particularly difficult passage in the left hand, I don't always focus directly on my left hand. I might sort of be aware of it, but I'm not looking directly at it. So I have found that sometimes can just help you trust your what's the right word, your motor memory a little bit more, so that you're not becoming self-conscious. You know, it's that weird thing sometimes when you're walking down the street, if you're not carrying anything and you don't know what to do with your hands. Has anyone else had that? That's that just me? So you're walking along, you just think, what am I going to do with these things? You know, you've got no pockets to put them in. Yeah, exactly. So what do you do when you walk along the street? And it's really odd. You just swing them from side to side, or you suddenly become self-conscious about things. You notice things. Or, you know, sometimes you'll be playing your guitar and then suddenly someone will walk in and they start watching you and you become self-conscious. I think what happens, that can happen to us when we're watching our own hands, that we look at a hand and we become conscious of it, and then it doesn't function in such a natural, fluid way. So I've personally found that helps quite a lot. And the breathing, especially when doing ornaments. Okay, I'm just going to skim through some of these other ones. Trill techniques. How to keep physical fitness. Is it okay to go to the gym and lift weights? I'm not sure I'm quite the right person to ask for this one, but all I will say is I'm a very keen walker. I walk a lot, but I don't really go to the gym. But I know what you mean. In other words, do the weights affect your hands? Yeah, you have to be a bit careful about things like that. Sometimes you can get a conflict between, let's say my daughter the other day was putting some IKEA furniture up. I don't know if you know IKEA or IKEA in India, where you buy self-assembly furniture and you put it together. And sometimes when you use the screwdriver, and you do that a lot all day, the next day I'm playing my guitar and I'm thinking, oh, my hand feels terrible. And then I suddenly remember that I was using the screwdriver all day yesterday. So you can get conflict between some activities and guitar playing, but I think as long as you're sensible about it and you don't suddenly do that. If I'd never lifted weights and I had a concert on Saturday and I lifted weights on Friday, that wouldn't probably be a very good idea. But if it's something you do regularly, it's fine. You just have to look after your hands. I mean, they're obviously very, very important. You can strain them and injure them. So I think everybody finds their own way of dealing with that sort of thing. If in doubt, just don't do anything too near when you need to be able to play. So if you have an exam next Saturday, maybe don't do the thing that could cause tension in your hands for 4 or 5 days before that. Just give your hands a break and just focus on your guitar playing. And then when you have a break and you don't have to play as much, then you might go out and do all your weights and your tennis or whatever it is, squash that you want to play. But it's actually very, very important to, without getting too, not to lecture anyone, but yeah, I think all of us spend a lot of time, particularly at the moment, indoors, and we play, music teaching and performing is a very sedentary activity where we're just sitting. So it's very, very important to get out into the world, and to be outdoors and to walk or to run or to swim. Or swimming is great, actually. It's very good for your shoulders and, relaxing. So I think as instrumentalists and musicians, it's a particularly important thing for us to do. And it also helps, keep your body moving in a different way to guitar. So if we only ever play guitar, we end up in that sort of, Picasso style old guitarist picture. Do you know the old guitarist? The old picture. I'm going to have to see if I can find it. Just bear with me 1 second. It's made me think I wanted to dig it out because it's a funny picture. Excuse me while I'm looking at my computer. The old guitarist. Picasso. Here we are. Images. I will reverse my screen again, and you can see the picture of the Old Guitarist by Picasso. Great picture, actually. This is what Wallace Stevens based his poem on this picture, and then Michael Tippett wrote the Blue Guitar based on the poem. And it is this one here. Can everyone see that? So we don't want to end up looking like that. You know, that's what happens if you do a bit too much guitar practice. So, you know, I mean, actually there's a serious point that, you know, there is a danger that we're sort of hunched over, and if you repeat, I always have this idea that you're doing something wrong all the time when you're practicing. If you think about it logically, unless we're doing everything perfectly, we must be doing something slightly wrong. And so if you keep repeating that over and over again, you're also repeating and practicing doing the wrong thing. So we can get into bad habits as well as good habits. So practice doesn't always solve everything. You know, it can create problems as well. Right, now let me go back to the chat. Bar chords, Buzzy. I'm just working up from the bottom. Bar chords, yeah, you can practice a little exercise, which is quite good. I'll just bring my tuning back up. The first thing to do with bar chords is to practice obviously playing half bars. You know, you're only ever playing half the strings, and you gradually work your way across through the repertoire that you play. A very good study for that actually is the Old Guitarist. Does everybody know that one? Very beautiful piece. That one. I used to find this one really difficult when I was younger. That barre, that one there. So yeah, they're very, very hard, and if you're young, you're about 11 or 12, don't worry if you find barres really, really difficult, because sometimes your hands just need to get bigger and stronger. I said to one of my pupils once, oh, don't worry, that'll be fine in about another 3 years' time. They looked really depressed, but there's an element of truth in that sometimes it just takes a lot of time. But a good exercise that you can try, that can teach you quite a lot about the barre, is to place down what looks like a full barre in 5th position. And say I was playing the bottom string, the A at the bottom, and the A at the top, but the other strings in between, I'm actually slightly arching my barre. Sometimes people call them a banana barre. I don't know if you can see that very clearly up there. So I'm arching the barre, so the strings in the middle are dead. So it looks like a barre, but actually all I'm really doing is doing the outer strings. I'm not putting pressure down on all of them. Now if you think about that logically, say I'm playing a chord like A major, 3 of the notes are already fretted higher than the barre. So I don't need to press really hard on the barre, because that's not really going to achieve anything round the back. I don't need to press those notes, but I do need to press the bass note, and I do need to press the top 2 strings quite hard. So the barre is, I'm trying to focus the energy on the barre into the right place. So I'm actually playing the top 2 strings, bottom string, but the other 3 are a bit dead because the fingers play them. So what I'm getting at is instead of using the full pressure of the barre on all of the strings, that requires a lot more pressure than if I'm doing this, where I'm actually only pressing the outer string. So you can use the pressure on the barre in different ways. When I was a kid, I used to be really fascinated by it. We used to have these little glass panes. I'm not even sure where they came from, but I used to put snails on top of them. It's a bit weird, but I put snails on the top, and then I used to like watching the snails crawl along from the glass underneath. I used to think this was really interesting, but And I always think, this is a bit odd, but just go with it, that the barre is a bit like the snail. And so if you imagine you were looking up from underneath through the glass, it's not flat on the floor. You know, it's moving around in waves, it's moving, it's bending, and it's flexing the shape. So it looks very, very fixed on the top, but actually what's often happening underneath are variations in the curvature and the shape of the barre. So that's obviously something you can explore, and you need a teacher to help you with it. But that's the basic principle. So try doing barres first of all, where you play a half barre. Sometimes very good to try practicing your other fingers up the strings. And then I might extend it across one other string. And then maybe 5 strings. And obviously the last one's going to be a lot harder. And that's quite a physical workout actually, and it's really not necessary to try that if you're of a sort of intermediate level. But half barre is a very, very good place to start. You know, try and find little studies that only require you to play maybe 3 or 4 of the strings, and remember where the pressure is needed. I mean, there's a really good example of that when you play Villa-Lobos number 1, the study. There's a place later on when it goes to here. So when you first shift, you don't need the barre, for example, until 3 notes in. 1, 2, 3, then the barre. And actually the barre is only the top 3 strings and the bottom one. These two don't have to be too much in terms of pressure. So, you know, it's this idea that you've got 6 strings, but you're not always required to press down so that all of them have equal pressure. And ultimately, that's the skill with a barre. It's about directed strength. It's not about brute force. It's about how you direct the pressure and the strength in the barre. But it's a very, very difficult technique, and people often find it frustrating. So if you're finding it frustrating, that's completely normal. Just hang in there. You will eventually kind of improve. But I remember finding it very, very difficult when I was kind of around about 11 or 12, just sort of finding anything with a bar chord really, really difficult. The question about harmonics in the bass, Siddharth, could you just explain what you mean by that?
So I was trying this piece where I found 2 notes on the bass and 1 note on the harmonic, like with 1 harmonic and 2 notes on the bass, like together. I don't know, how do you do that?
If the 2 notes in the bass, were the 2 notes in the bass next to each other, or was there a string between them?
There was a string between them,
string between them. Okay. Yeah, I mean, normally what happens is you use your A and your I finger on the top. I mean, an easier version of that is the Wharton Bagatelle. Do you know the piece that goes, the one that goes? Now later on you have to do harmonics on that, where you play. Now what you're doing there is the A and the I are on the top, like that. The middle finger is on the string below. All right, and then your thumb. So it's like this shape. I'll do it. It's quite. I don't know if you can see that there in the right hand. Yeah. So what you probably have to do is this. Or what you can do, if it's was it an open D? Were they open strings?
I'm not really sure. Let me just see that. 1 second. Just a second. It's taking time to load. Yeah,
That's fine.
It came. Yes. Yeah. It's a C, C-A-F. Yeah.
Show me. Play me the chord. Play me the chord without the harmonic. And which one's the harmonic? The top one?
The top one, yeah.
I suspect. Have you tried a thumb strike? Have you tried striking? Yeah, so that you play the harmonic at the same time as striking the thumb. Sometimes you can bring your thumb across more than one string at the same time. He says, I'm just playing one thumb strike, but it's hitting 2 or 3 strings.
There's one more place where it's a B and a D with an A on the top.
Yes, well, that's exactly it. Now, what you would do there, where's it gone there? Yeah, so your A finger and your I finger would do the harmonic, and your middle finger would pluck the D, and your thumb would pluck the B. Like that, yeah?
Ooh.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yes.
So
yes,
the
a lot.
part
Yeah.
looks like that, you see. Is that visible? I can't quite see myself. On
Yes,
the screen.
yes.
Yeah. So basically what it is that your middle finger, instead of being in front, has to drop behind the harmonic. So it's like that. So instead of where it would normally be, it has to kind of, imagine you're holding your fingers like this. You can try that if you like. Now try moving your middle finger backwards, but not the other fingers. That's it. So that it ends up underneath the other note, and then you pluck those two with your thumb and your middle, and you play the harmonic with the others. It's tricky. It's very tricky, because it's a bit like you're trying to get your hand to do 3 different jobs, under one umbrella. But think of that as one element. It's almost a bit like, in the cinema when you do that. Projectors, you do that. It's a bit like that. So you do that, and you'd see these bits up here. That's the harmonic. You see, and that's the bit where you're plucking. So pluck with those and do the harmonic with the upper bits. I've never thought of it like that. I'm going to remember that one. Useful teaching analogy. Okay, good. And there was a question about trills. Yeah, trills. Well, trills and how to be good at sight reading. My advice at sight reading is, obviously there are books and materials that you can buy. I think the Associated Board do one called Joining the Dots, which is very good. So if you want to follow a method for improving your sight reading, obviously, how do we improve our reading of a language? We do it by reading other books. And we do it by starting with easy books and gradually going to more complicated books. So for guitar purposes, my advice would be to improve your sight reading, start with very easy things to read, single line melodies, and make sure that what you're reading is much, much easier than your level. So if you're a grade 5 player, make your sight reading grade 2 pieces, grade 1 pieces, grade 2 pieces, and just read through lots and lots of easy things. It's just the process of reading that helps you become better at sight reading. Guitar sight reading is, every instrument has its difficulties, but guitar sight reading does throw up some particular challenges because of the multiple location of notes. So because you can play an open E and you can play a fingered E in 3 or 4 other places, you often have 2 or 3 different choices as to where to play a chord or a shape. So you might read the correct notes but play them in the wrong position. So there are complexities on the guitar fingerboard that make sight reading particularly difficult, but I think without making excuses, generally guitarists aren't particularly good at reading. So I think it's something that we as an instrumental group can look to try and improve. So my advice would be, like with anything, start with very, very easy things. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing easy stuff. Never feel when you're learning that you're going backwards by playing something easy. If your teacher says, right, let's do something much easier, never ever feel insulted by that, because it often helps you revisit or repair something in your playing, so that then you can go, it's a bit like retreating in order to advance. You sometimes have to go back a little bit just to retrace your steps in order to progress forwards in a different direction. So same with sight reading. Go back and do very, very easy sight reading. You know, find the grade 1 examples in a book if you've got them, and practice reading them all. Practice writing in some fingerings. And gradually, if you do it, it's like anything, as a regular thing, you'll start to develop a little bit more confidence. The most important thing about sight reading is not to be able to play something brilliantly after 30 seconds in an exam. Most important thing is that you can go away and learn pieces in a slightly quicker, more efficient way. So it helps you to learn more music more quickly if you can read well. In the same way with the language, you can read more books and enjoy more literature if your reading is good. So the same thing applies with music sight reading. I've known brilliant players who are not very good readers, and I've known brilliant readers who are not very good players. So the two things aren't automatically connected, but there's no denying that as it's a language, it's definitely something that I think can really help you and can help you improve. Other instrumentalists, it's slightly different. So if you're an orchestral player, you're getting so used to always reading a part, it becomes automatic. I mean, in England, they often say that British orchestral sight reading is supposed to be very, very good, some of the best in the world, because they often have very little rehearsal time. So they've developed, you know, the way of practicing and playing under pressure and learning music quickly. So I think it's like anything, it's a muscle that needs exercising, and if you do it regularly with very, very easy material, you will find over time it starts to improve a little bit. Now let me go back to what I was talking about with the good at sight reading, trill techniques. Yeah, I mean, obviously with trilling, you have a choice of fingered trills where you're plucking or slurring in the left hand. Let's say we took E to D sharp, you know, or G sharp to A. So all you're really doing is slurring, hammering on and pulling off. So my advice would be to practice doing that with different pairs of fingers. Practice can be very mathematical, you know, you just work out the combinations. So that's just those combinations. Sometimes people do what's called a double trill. So when I hammer on the first time, I hammer on using finger 2. When I hammer on the second time, I use finger 3. So the left hand is alternating between 3 and 2 on the slur. Now, there are ways of playing trills that are what we call cross-string trills, where you're playing one note on one string and another note on another string. So say I took D sharp. Alright, what I'm doing is I'm playing the top E string and I'm playing the second string of D sharp. I need to warm up a bit, though. What you're doing there is it's almost like a tremolo technique that you're doing across two strings. So in this particular case, I was playing PA, IM. Imagine I was playing two pairs of two strings, P and A, I and M, then arpeggiating them. Sometimes in Baroque music, you have a choice sometimes as to whether you execute trills using slurred trill in the left hand or a cross-string trill. Sometimes you can use a combination of both, where you mix, where you might start a trill with a cross-string element and then finish off with a slur. It's a very, very complex art, and you know, ornaments are really. Every ornament has its own context, so you really find they're identical to one another. So each one needs its own sort of special consideration. But essentially, it's worth trying to practice both if you're playing repertoire where you've got you know, extensive ornamentation. Think about whether you're going to play left-hand slurred ornaments or you're going to play right-hand cross-string trills. Be slightly careful of mixing them up too much. You know, if you choose one within a piece, it's normally best to keep with that sound world than it is to mix them together too much. But that's essentially how you can do them. I think we might be getting okay. So the thing we were talking about at the very beginning, we talked a little bit about exam technique, and we were talking about obviously one of the things you can do to give yourself the best chance is make sure that the pieces you're playing, that you're very experienced at performing them. Nearly always, most exam boards ask for 3 pieces. The other thing you can practice to do is to play them in a different order. So you nearly always have the choice of which piece you play first. So if you've got 3 pieces, you know, A, B, C, you try A, B, C, A, C, B, BAC, BCA, CAB, CBA. You've got 6 combinations of the order that you could play those in. And you might find that if you start with piece A, that it makes you very tired, and then piece B feels really difficult. But you might find if you start with piece B, it's quite gentle, and maybe you like it and you're more confident, and it helps you warm up. And then when you play piece A, it doesn't feel quite so bad when it's the second piece in the program and you've had maybe 5 minutes to get used to being in the room. Maybe your second piece, perhaps it feels quite good then, or maybe as the last piece you feel at your best after 10 minutes in the exam room, so you play the really hard piece as the last one. Conversely, it might be that by the end you're getting mentally tired and one of the pieces is harder to remember, say from memory. So you might decide you want to play that piece first because you're fresher, mentally more alert, and perhaps by the end of the pieces you're getting tired and you're more likely to forget things. So I think that's a really very simple but useful thing, certainly in terms of pieces. People often have the choice of playing scales first and then pieces afterwards. I think scales first is probably better, personally, because I think there's something about the scales that warms up your fingers, helps you maybe play away a few nerves and gets you ready to perform. So obviously warming up before the exam is very important, but don't keep playing your 3 pieces over and over again on the day so that by the time you do the exam you're really, really tired and then you end up playing the pieces badly. Sometimes all you have to do is warm up with some very, very simple exercises and things, something nice and straightforward with open strings, just a few stretches in the left hand, and then you can perform your pieces. And if you really want to kind of keep them in your mind, you can practice looking at the score. You know, you can have the music in a waiting room and look at the score, or you can play through the pieces very, very quietly, but not full volume. You know, if you play the trumpet or the trombone, you can't afford to keep playing the pieces because your lip gets tired. Or if you're a singer, singers save their voices a little bit. So sometimes you can underplay on the guitar and not use all the pressure and not use all of your stamina, but you can still play through a piece very, very quietly and sketchily, and that will give you a good feel. It gets you ready for playing it properly. Obviously, with things like sight reading, part of the pressure, I think, comes from the fact that we know we've only got, say, 30 seconds or whatever to get it ready in, which immediately, if you're anything like me, as soon as someone tells me I've got 30 seconds to do something, my brain freezes up. They have a quiz show over here called Countdown, and you have to work out a mathematical conundrum at the end, and you have 30 seconds, and I can never do it because as soon as someone says you've got 30 seconds, I can't think straight. But just have a method. You know, one of the things with sight reading is make sure you've looked through all of it. The usual caveats: time signature, key signature, essential. A very, very useful thing can be to look out for highest and lowest notes. So when you scan through, try and look for the places that are the highest, because that's probably where you're going to be having to play in higher positions, where you're less familiar with the fingerboard. So sometimes spending a bit of time working out the high position notes can be useful, because you'll probably be fine with the notes down in lower positions. And obviously try and observe things like dynamic detail. Sometimes if if your sight reading is very good and you don't get full marks, it's often because the examiners pick people up on small details, like you didn't play piano or you didn't play forte, things like that. But there's no magic bullet for sight reading. You know, as I said, if you keep practicing it and doing it regularly, hopefully you'll acquire a little bit more confidence. Oral tests, again, I think it's something that needs to become part of your regular lessons and thinking. You know, if you don't ever sing the tune in your piece, try singing the tune as you play along. It's a very, very simple and useful technique sometimes, just to start singing and making singing part of your musical practice and your lessons and your training. It depends obviously which exam board you're doing as to what the oral tests are, but just listen very, very carefully to the questions as well. It's quite hard sometimes when you're under pressure. It can be easy actually just to mishear or to lose concentration. Don't be afraid occasionally, if you're really stuck, of asking the examiner to play something again. They quite often have some liberty just to play something for an extra playing if you're finding it particularly difficult. And don't panic if you get one particular question wrong or you struggle with it, because you often find it's a very, very small part of the entire exam. It's like with scales. If you mess up 1 or 2 scales, and say you're asked 12 scales and you mess up 2 of them, you know, you're not going to fail your exam off the back of 2 scales. But, you know, obviously we want, you know, and sometimes re-attempting a scale is fine. You might go back and play one twice to try and get it correct. But people sometimes worry a little bit disproportionately about how those kind of things will affect a mark. I think an examiner can tell when you're playing pretty well whether you're making a mistake through nerves or whether you're making a mistake because you just don't know some of the requirements. And like I said, practice having a run through, do a mock exam either with your teacher, or maybe you could, what I used to do with scales is I used to get, I can't remember, I think it was one of my teachers used to tell me this, you used to you'd write the scales out on a little piece of paper and chuck them in a hat, all the scales you had to learn, and then you just do a lucky dip and you put your hand in the hat, lift out a scale, and you had to play that scale. So it's like having the examiner ask you a random scale. I found that was really helpful. And also you can practice playing at exactly the same time that your exam's at. So if your exam is at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, then, you know, you put on the same gear you're going to play in. Say you're wearing a suit, put your suit on the week before, 4 o'clock, sit down and you play at the same time in the same clothes that you will play in when you do your exam in a week's time. And it sort of helps you visualize and feel, make sure you're comfortable with what you're wearing. And it helps you feel then when you do the exam, it's almost like you've already rehearsed and done some of that element before. It doesn't feel so new. So they're just a few small tips I think that can help with your playing. And obviously it goes without saying, make sure you've had plenty to drink. Sometimes people don't have enough to drink. If we don't drink enough water, our brains tend to sort of start slowing down a little bit. So make sure you're hydrated. You might find having, you know, if you don't like eating very much because you're nervous, try and eat something very, very small that just gives you a little bit of extra energy and blood sugar for performing. If you've not had food, you know, you might be nervous, not because of your shaking because of nerves, but because you just haven't had enough to eat. So it's really important sometimes to have a little bit of a routine with those kind of things, so that, you know, we're, in a sense, we're like athletes. We need to have fuel and a good routine in order to stand the best chance of playing your best. So, you know, I beforehand have something small, and, you know, and hopefully then when I'm playing examination, I'm not sitting there thinking I'm hungry or my stomach's rumbling or I'm feeling faint because I've not had enough to eat. Bananas are good. Lots of musicians eat bananas before concerts. They're supposed to have a sort of natural stress relief. I think it's vitamin B6, apparently. I think it's that. I might have got that completely wrong. But anyway, any other questions? Has anyone added something to our chat? I think, Vida, was I right in thinking that you wanted me to play something at some point if you're there?
Yes, that would be lovely. A great way to end the session.
Well, I thought I could do that. I mean, I could. I'm not worried. I'm not in a hurry at all. I don't even know what the time is actually. Oh, that's fine. Yeah. Well, why don't I play? I mean, I could play "Birds Flew Over the Spire," and I'll play you one of the things that I did recently in lockdown. Let me have a look. I'll do that. Maybe playing would be nice. It was so long since I played Birds Flew Over the Spire, I had to get my music out to remind myself of how it goes, even though I wrote the piece myself. You find this happens as you get older. The more pieces you write, you can't remember the ones you wrote when you were younger. One day I should say, "Oh, this is quite nice, this piece. Who wrote that?" And someone will say, "You did." I'm a bit worried about that day. Okay. I need my glasses now. Okay, so this is Birds Flew Over the Spire, which apparently, according to my piece of music, I wrote in 2005. It's quite an interesting thing, actually, not in my case, but is often to think about when composers, what age they were when they wrote pieces of music. So like some of the Villa-Lobos Suite Populaire Brésilienne, the first couple he wrote when he was very young. So it's the sort of music of a young man, you know, and then sometimes there are other things later on. I think it's quite interesting, that side of composition. Okay, anything could happen here. People use the funny little thing, don't they? They use the funny little hands clapping at the top. It looks like I'm clapping myself for my own performance, doesn't it? So this next one is, over the last sort of year, I got very, very interested in the C and G tuning down in the bass. So C in the bass, G on the 5th string, and then the rest of the guitar tuned as normal. And I've been, for about the last sort of on and off for about 18 months, has been working on a set of folk arrangements. Actually, I probably started them just after I came to Calcutta, actually. I started off with one Swedish one, and then worked through a load of others, but the most recent one I did was a tune by Vaughan Williams, the great English composer who was very interested in folk music, And the interesting thing about this was that I thought it was a traditional folk tune that he'd arranged, but it's actually a tune that's written by him that just sounds like a folk tune. It's called Lyndon Lee. It's a song, and it's often sung by choirs or soloists. So I was trying to work on this, and it comes from Dorset. For those of you familiar with the UK, beautiful county. This is Lyndon Lee. Lyndon being a tree, I think. The linden tree, yeah. I might have got that wrong. That's the first time I've performed that. There we are. I'll do one more. And I did when I was at school, I used to like Lord of the Dance, the tune. I don't know if you know that tune. And it's a Quaker tune. A Shaker tune? Quaker tune? Which one is it? It's the Shaker tune. Shaker tune, not a Quaker tune. And called Simple Gifts, which Aaron Copland used in Appalachian Spring. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, any more burning questions before I disappear? It's gone very quiet out there. You're all still there. Have you gone off? I always get slightly paranoid that people are sitting watching Netflix and eating pizza. Do you know what I mean? You just don't know when there's anybody. They might all have gone. Let me have a quick look at the last one.
I think there are more questions in the
Okay.
chat, but
Memories of Summer. Oh yeah. Right. Okay. I'll see if I can play. Now, did I print? I think I've got Memories of Summer on the on my screen. Let me just print it up. Just looking quickly along some of these questions, someone said about calluses on your left hand. I would use a very gently file them with a nail file, but just or nail papers. Because sometimes, you know, we get these sort of nail things with your fingers, and it just takes the edge off if you're finding you're getting slurs that are a bit. The sound quality is not great because you've got hard skin on the end of your fingers. Just file it off using the sandpaper. That would be my advice for that one. Right. So, Memories of Summer. Although we're in the midst of summer at the moment. Okay.